Rick and Morty has been on the air for more than 10 years, and it is still sitting on questions it has never answered. A character appeared in a family living room in Season 2 with no history and no explanation, and the show simply moved forward as though he had always been there. A Morty looked at everything that had been done to him, built a plan across 4 full seasons, and vanished through a yellow portal into a part of the multiverse nobody has followed him into yet. Time froze for 6 months, and when it unfroze, it split reality into pieces. A dead snake in space started a war that eventually produced time-traveling snake terminators. A civilization was born and died and built entire religions across thousands of years inside a cabinet in Rick's garage. Tonight we are walking through every unsolved mystery and every time paradox this show has ever produced, slowly and carefully, one after another. Welcome to Ricktopus. Let us get into it. The mystery of Rick's true past. There is a version of Rick Sanchez that nobody has ever fully seen. Not the Rick who stumbles into the garage with a flask and a half-finished invention. Not the Rick who pulls Morty through a portal with a deadline and no explanation. Not even the Rick who sits quietly at the dinner table, saying almost nothing, watching the family with eyes that seem to be calculating something nobody else in the room can see. Those versions are familiar. Those versions have been on screen for 7 seasons. The version nobody has fully seen is the one that existed before all of it. Before the portal gun. Before the Citadel. Before the decades of running and fighting and drinking and arriving eventually at the Smith family home and deciding, for reasons the show has never completely explained, to stay. That version is the mystery, and it is one the show has spent 7 seasons slowly, carefully, deliberately not solving. This is where the story of Rick Sanchez actually begins, and it begins not with Rick himself, but with a knock at a garage door in Dimension C-137. A man who looks exactly like Rick shows up. He has a portal gun, he has a pitch. He tells the younger Rick, the one who has a wife named Diane and a daughter named Beth, and no particular plans to blow up the universe, that he has cracked interdimensional travel and wants to share the schematics. The younger Rick says no. He is happy. He has a family. He does not need whatever this stranger is offering. And then a bomb falls through a portal and lands in the garage and kills Diane and kills Beth, and the world that Rick Sanchez had built for himself ends in a few seconds on an otherwise ordinary day. That is the origin. The show revealed it in pieces across several seasons, first in a fabricated flashback in Season 3 that turned out to be a decoy, then in the real version in the Season 5 finale, and then in even greater depth in Season 7, when the full scope of what Rick Prime had done to every version of Diane across all of infinity finally came into focus. The broad strokes of the backstory are no longer a mystery. The bomb fell, Rick lost everything. He spent decades hunting the Rick who did it. He eventually found him and killed him. But here is where the show gets interesting, and where the mystery opens up rather than closes. Because knowing what happened to Rick does not explain who Rick was before it happened. The show gives the impression, especially in the fabricated Season 3 flashback, that the Rick of Dimension C-137 was once a gentler person, a man who turned down ultimate power because he had something worth more, a man who chose his family over a portal gun. That reading is emotionally satisfying. It makes Rick's current state feel like damage rather than nature. It makes the drinking and the cruelty and the deliberate self-destruction feel like responses to grief rather than expressions of character. But the show is careful, always careful, never to confirm that reading completely. Because the Rick who appears in the actual verified flashbacks, the ones the show seems to treat as real, is not quite the warm and gentle man that reading requires. He is sharp. He is already a genius operating well outside the boundaries of what anyone around him can follow. He was already in his garage working on things that nobody else could understand, even before the portal gun arrived. Dan Harmon confirmed in multiple interviews from 2015 onward that the writers made a deliberate choice to keep Rick's pre-tragedy personality vague, because making it too soft, too innocent, too clearly good would flatten the character into something simpler than what the show needed him to be. The mystery, then, is not just what happened to Rick. The mystery is who he was to begin with, and whether the person he became was always inside him waiting, or whether Diane's death manufactured someone entirely new. This question runs under the surface of nearly every Rick scene in the show. When Rick is cruel to Morty in a way that seems designed to keep him at arm's length, is that grief? Protective instinct? Or is it just who Rick is, and the tragedy of Diane gave him permission to stop pretending otherwise? The show leaves that open. It sets up evidence for both readings, and never commits to one. Rick himself is not a reliable narrator. He has fabricated memories of his own origin and played them back as if they were real. He has lied lied to Morty about fundamental things. He has made statements about who he is and then acted in ways that directly contradict them, sometimes within the same episode. There is also the matter of what happened between the moment Diane died and the moment Rick showed up at Beth's door as an old man. The show fills in some of this. Rick hunted Rick Prime. He became a terrorist, in the language the show uses, fighting against the Galactic Federation. He built and then rejected the Citadel. He developed portal technology of his own, which raises its own question, because if Rick Prime's initial offer was the portal gun formula, and Rick turned it down, then the Rick of C-137 reinvented portal technology independently from grief and rage, rather than from collaboration. That is a meaningful distinction. A man who can replicate entirely on his own and through decades of work, something that another genius had to offer him as a gift, is not a man who is simply a good husband with a normal garage before tragedy found him. He was already something extraordinary. The tragedy did not create his genius. It redirected it. And then there is the question of Beth. If Diane and young Beth were both killed in the garage explosion, then the Beth who is alive in the show is not Rick's original daughter. She is a Beth from a different dimension. The dimension Rick eventually settled in after the death of C-137's Rick, whose place he took. The show confirmed this, quietly, through the Cronenberg episode logic and the way Rick talks about dimension hopping as something he has done before. The Rick on screen is C-137. The family he lives with is not originally his. Which means every moment of Rick's apparent love for Beth, every flicker of something genuine in his face when she is in danger, every decision he makes that seems to be protecting her, is being directed at someone who is not actually the daughter he lost. She is a replacement he found, and he has never told her that. He has never told anyone that. The show does not frame this as something sinister. It frames it, when it addresses it at all, as something that exists in the background of every family scene, giving those scenes a weight that would not be there if Rick's history were simple. He is living with a version of his daughter. He is calling her Beth. He is, in some broken and indirect way, trying to do for this Beth what he could not do for the Beth who died. Whether that is love or guilt or something that does not have a clean name is something the show refuses to say. Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland discussed the decision not to over-explain Rick's past in multiple interviews across the show's run. The core of their reasoning was consistent. The less precisely you define what Rick lost, the more powerfully his behavior communicates the weight of it. If the show had spent an episode showing Rick and Diane's perfect marriage and their warm family mornings and their ordinary happy life, then cut to the explosion, the result would have been grief that the audience could track and measure. Instead, the show gives glimpses, a blurred memory, a voice on a computer that sounds like her, a face on a robot trap built by a man who could not stop himself from putting her face on things even while claiming to have moved on. That restraint is what makes Rick's grief feel real in a way that a full backstory would not. Grief that cannot be fully described is more honest than grief that has been neatly explained, but it does leave the mystery intact. And there are questions within the mystery that the show seems unlikely to ever fully answer. There is the question of why Rick Prime bombed C-137's garage in the first place. The show frames this as punishment for Rick's refusal to accept the portal gun. But Rick Prime's character, as it is eventually revealed in Season 7, is not someone who kills out of wounded pride. He is someone who kills to remove attachments. He does not want other Ricks to have families. He does not want to be the only Rick who gave everything up for freedom while other versions of himself stayed home and chose love. The bombing reads less like an act of anger and more like an act of philosophy. Rick Prime decided that connection was weakness, gave up everything to prove it, and then systematically destroyed the evidence that other choices were possible. There is something almost sad in that, and the show is aware of it. Rick Prime and Rick C-137 are mirrors of each other. One chose freedom and became monstrous. One had freedom forced on him and became something more complicated. The question the show never quite answers is whether, if the bomb had not fallen, Rick C-137 would have eventually made the same choice as Rick Prime on his own. Whether the hunger that makes Rick who he is, the hunger for knowledge and power and the ability to do anything, anywhere, with no one able to stop him, whether that hunger would have eventually outgrown a quiet life in a garage in one dimension. The show allows the question to exist without answering it. That is what makes Rick Sanchez, after 7 seasons and hundreds of episodes, still genuinely surprising. He is a character whose nature is not fully known, even by the people who write him, because the mystery of what he was before is the engine that keeps everything else running. The trauma made him, or revealed him, or both. Nobody knows. Maybe not even Rick. And on some level, that is exactly why the show has run as long as it has. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick's past is a wound the show has never fully opened, built from fabricated memories and deliberate silences that keep the character permanently infinitely larger than any explanation of him. Next, the mystery moves closer to home, into the Smith family itself, where a decision Rick made about his own daughter produced a question that nobody, including Rick, is allowed to answer. Section 2. The question that has no answer. Which Beth is real? There are two women who believe they are Beth Smith. They have the same face, the same voice, the same childhood memories of growing up with a father who was either absent or overwhelming, and never quite anything in between. They remember the same arguments, the same silences, the same particular feeling of never being fully certain whether Rick was proud of them or simply tolerating them the way he tolerated most things that could not be improved with a screwdriver. They both remember being young. They both remember being afraid. They both remember deciding, at some point, that they were stronger than the fear. And that strength looks identical on both of them because it came from the same place. One of them is the original Beth Smith. One of them is a clone. Neither of them knows which. And Rick, who made the clone, who had the memory of the decision extracted from his own mind and stored in a small tube, who is the only person who was ever in a position to answer the question, made absolutely certain that the answer would be unreachable. Not just to the family, not just to the audience, to himself. That choice is the mystery, and it is one of the most quietly devastating things the show has ever done. To understand how the show got here, it helps to go back to Season 3, Episode 9, which is called The ABCs of Beth. In that episode, Beth has a long and uncomfortable conversation with Rick about her own nature. She has spent most of her adult life wondering whether the darkness she feels inside her, the cruelty she is capable of, the coldness that surfaces in her worst moments as a mother and a wife and a person, whether that darkness is hers or whether it is something she inherited from Rick. Rick's answer, delivered with the particular honesty he reserves for moments when honesty is more destabilizing than a lie, is that Beth is very much like him. That the things she is afraid of in herself are not defects, they are traits. They are the same traits that allowed Rick to do everything he has ever done. And then, because it is Rick, and because he has a solution to most problems, even when the solution creates several new ones, he offers her a choice. She can stay. She can keep the life she has, the house, the children, the husband she is not sure she loves, the horse surgery practice that is competent but not thrilling. Or he can make a clone of her, a perfect copy with all her memories intact, and that clone can stay in her place, while the real Beth goes out into the universe and finds out who she actually is without all of it weighing on her. The episode ends without showing what Beth decided. That was a deliberate choice by the writers, and it was one of the more elegant mysteries the show had constructed up to that point, because the ambiguity itself was meaningful. The question of whether the Beth on screen from that point forward was the real Beth or a clone living her life without knowing it introduced a low, constant tension into every subsequent family scene. Every moment of Beth being a good mother or a bad one, every moment of her choosing Jerry or choosing herself, every moment of her and Rick finding something like peace with each other, all of it sat inside the question of whether the person doing those things was the woman who made a choice or the woman who was made as a consequence of one. Then Season 4 arrived, and the show did something nobody expected. The finale of Season 4, Star Mort Rick Turn of the Jerry, opens with a version of Beth doing things that the Beth on Earth has not been shown doing. She is in space. She is leading a rebellion. She has a different haircut and a different energy and a fluency with violence that feels earned rather than panic. And she believes, with genuine certainty, that she is the real Beth, the one who chose adventure, the one who left. Which would mean the Beth on Earth, the one having breakfast with Jerry and the kids and doing the quiet, ordinary things that family life requires, is the clone. Except that the space Beth finds an implant in her neck, a small device Rick installed that she initially believes would detonate if she returned to Earth, and the existence of that implant makes her suddenly, horribly uncertain. Why would Rick install something like that unless he wanted to make sure she never came back? Why would he need to keep her away unless the original Beth was still at home and her return would cause a problem that he did not want to deal with? She goes to Earth anyway. She confronts Rick, and Rick, in what is genuinely one of his worst moments across the entire series, admits that he does not know which of them is the original. He made the clone, imbued it with every memory the real Beth had up to that moment, and then had a machine switch them around while his back was turned. He engineered his own ignorance. He built the uncertainty in deliberately so that the question could never be weaponized against him. If he does not know, he cannot be accused of preferring one Beth over the other. If he does not know, he never has to sit across from one of his daughters and tell her that she is not real. It is a cowardly thing to do, dressed up as a generous one. And the show is aware of that. Both Beths understand it. Neither of them forgives it it immediately. They are angry at Rick in the specific way that people are angry when someone they love refuses to be accountable for something they cannot undo. The anger does not resolve cleanly. It sits there, complicated, the way most things in Rick's relationships do. But then something unexpected happens. By the end of the episode, both Beths make a choice that the show treats as more important than the original question. They decide they do not want to know. Rick has a memory stored in a tube. He retrieves it. He holds it out. And neither Beth asks to see it. Not because they have stopped caring, but because they have arrived, separately and at the same time, at the realization that the answer would not actually change who they are. The clone has all the memories. The clone has all the pain and all the love and all the complicated history with Rick and Jerry and the kids that makes Beth who she is. If the clone is the one who stayed on Earth, she stayed not because a program told her to, but because, when faced with the life that was in front of her, something in her chose it. And if the real Beth is the one in space, she is not more real because of that. She is just a Beth who made a different choice. The show is making an argument through this, and it is a more interesting argument than it might first appear. Identity, the episode suggests, is not in the origin. It is not in the biology or the decision point or the original moment of authenticity. Identity is in the accumulation. It is in what happens after. Both Beths have been living their lives fully, making real decisions with real consequences, loving real people, and being hurt by real things. The question of which one started in a lab is almost irrelevant next to the weight of everything that came after. Rick understands this, which is why he built the uncertainty in from the beginning. He did not want to create a clone and a real person. He wanted to create two real people, both of them Beth, both of them equally his daughter, so that no matter what happened, he could not be accused of having made one of them less. Whether that is wisdom or manipulation is something the show never fully decides, probably because it is both. What makes this mystery linger, even now, is that the show has essentially taken the position that the question cannot and should not be resolved. The writers have said in interviews that they deliberately designed the situation so that no definitive answer was possible, even in the production materials. There is no official answer in the writer's room. There is no document somewhere that says this one is real and this one is the copy. The ambiguity was written all the way down to the foundation. Space Beth has continued to appear in subsequent seasons. She and Earth Beth have developed a relationship that is strange and warm and occasionally funny in the specific way that talking to yourself would be funny if you and yourself had made entirely different choices and were now comparing notes. They are not the same person anymore. Whatever they were at the moment of separation, they have grown in different directions since. Space Beth has experiences that Earth Beth will never have. Earth Beth has a continuity of home and family that Space Beth gave up. Each of them is becoming more distinctly herself with every episode, which makes the question of which is real feel increasingly like the wrong question to be asking. The right question might be what it means that Rick created this situation at all. Because he had the option of just asking Beth what she wanted, she was an adult. She was capable of making the decision herself. He did not need to clone her and switch them and erase his own memory of what happened. He could have had a conversation. He chose not to. He chose instead to take the decision away from both of them and replace it with a mystery that nobody could ever solve. That is very Rick. The kindness and the arrogance wound around each other until you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. And the Beth who got the life she did not choose, whichever one that was, has spent every day since living it as fully as she can, which is, perhaps, the only honest answer the show is ever going to give. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Beth clone mystery is a question Rick built to have no answer, and the show has honored that silence ever since. Next, a character who appeared with no explanation at all, has never been given a clean origin, and whose very existence one of the show's own creators has described as something close to impossible. Section 3. The Strange Case of Mr. Poopy Butthole. Some characters arrive in a story with a history behind them. There are things that happened before the first scene, relationships that were formed before the audience showed up, reasons for why this person is in this room with these people that the narrative can gesture toward, even if it never fully explains them. The audience accepts this. It is part of how storytelling works. Not everything needs to be shown from the beginning. Some things are simply understood to have existed before the camera arrived. Mr. Poopy Butthole is not one of those characters. He appears in Season 2, Episode 4, Total Recall, without any setup at all. He is simply there, in the Smith family home, sitting comfortably, being greeted warmly by everyone in the room, treated as though he has been a fixture of this family's life for as long as any of them can remember. He has a name that sounds like a joke. He has a small, round body and large, expressive eyes, and a voice that is genuinely warm in a way that feels disarming, and every member of the Smith family, Rick included, behaves as though his presence is completely normal, as though he has always been here, as though there was never a time when he was not. The audience has never seen him before in their lives. This would not be strange on its own. Total Recall is an episode built entirely around the premise that the Smith home has been invaded by alien parasites that reproduce by implanting false memories into their hosts. The parasites create fictional people, embed those fictional people into the family's recollections, and then manifest physically so that the family believes they have always known them. The episode is, at its core, about the unreliability of memory and the ease with which trust can be manufactured when the manufacturing is done from the inside out. Every strange new character who appears in the episode, the flashbacks filled with people nobody remembers meeting, but everyone is certain they have known forever, every one of them is a parasite wearing a fabricated relationship like a costume. The genius of the episode is that Mr. Poopy Butthole is presented in exactly the same way. He arrives with the parasites. He exists in the same warm, fond, too good to be true register that the parasites occupy. He has no verifiable history. He shows up with a smile and an ease that suggests deep familiarity and offers nothing concrete that would distinguish him from every other implanted fiction walking around the Smith living room. And then Morty figures out the rule. The parasites, he realizes, can only create positive memories. They cannot implant painful ones, embarrassing ones, complicated ones, because those kinds of memories would make the host suspicious rather than compliant. Every fake character in the house exists in a cloud of warmth and nostalgia and uncomplicated affection. So the method of identifying them is simple in theory and brutal in practice. If a character has no bad memories attached to them, they are a parasite. If a character exists in the family's minds as someone who has only ever been good, only ever been pleasant, only ever made them feel welcome and loved and happy, that character is not real. Beth goes through this logic and arrives at Mr. Poopy Butthole. She cannot think of a single bad memory involving him. Not one uncomfortable moment, not one argument, one disappointment, one instance where he let her down or she let him down, or things between them were anything other than easy and kind. He passes every test a parasite would pass. He fails every test a real person with a real history would pass. She shoots him. He does not dissolve into alien goo the way the parasites do. He screams. He bleeds. He is taken to a hospital. He survives, eventually, and the show follows his recovery across several seasons in small, quiet glimpses that treat his injury as a real consequence with a real emotional weight. He gets a cane. He goes through physical therapy. He gets a degree. He meets someone. He gets married. He has a child. His life continues with the texture and the accumulation of detail that fictional characters do not get, because fictional characters do not need to fill in the spaces between their plot-relevant appearances. So he is real. The evidence that he is real is overwhelming by every standard the show has established for what real means inside its own logic. He bleeds. He recovers slowly. He has bad memories of being shot by someone he trusted. He has a life that existed before the episode and continues after it in directions that have nothing to do with Rick or Morty or any adventure. He is, by every measure the show offers, a genuine person with a genuine history who has genuinely known this family for a long time. But the show never explains where he came from. Not once. Not in passing, not in a throwaway line that a careful viewer might catch if they are paying close attention. Total Recall introduces him, and the series simply continues with him in it, treating his presence the way you would treat the presence of any longtime family friend, which is to say, with the casual familiarity of people who have stopped explaining things to each other because they have known each other long enough that explanation feels redundant. Except the audience has never been given that explanation. The audience has been placed in the position of the Smith family without being given the memories the Smith family presumably has. The show asks its viewers to accept Mr. Poopy Butthole in the same way that Beth and Jerry and Rick accept him, on the basis of warmth and comfort and the simple fact of his presence, and then uses the parasite episode to make everyone, audience included, feel the specific discomfort of realizing that acceptance might have no foundation under it. That is a genuinely sophisticated thing to do with a character whose name sounds like a children's insult. Dan Harmon spoke about Mr. Poopy Butthole in a 2017 interview with Cinema Blend, and what he said is interesting not because it resolves the mystery, but because it adds another layer to it. Harmon offered a theory, framed as his own speculation rather than confirmed canon, that Mr. Poopy Butthole might be a different kind of entity entirely, where the alien parasites are malicious, inserting themselves into families in order to eventually overrun and consume, Mr. Poopy Butthole might be something analogous but fundamentally different in intent. Harmon described the idea that wherever parasites bloom, Mr. Poopy Butthole's kind might also appear, drawn by the same conditions, but motivated by something else entirely. Not predatory, not manipulative, something more like a symbiont, a creature that inserts itself into a family's life and history, not to feed on them, but simply to exist alongside them, bringing genuine warmth rather than manufactured warmth, real affection rather than the imitation of it. This would explain why he has no bad memories attached to him, not as a sign that he is fabricated, but as a reflection of what he actually is. If he is a being whose nature is to be genuinely kind, genuinely supportive, genuinely present in the way that the best people in anyone's life manage to be, then the absence of bad memories is not suspicious, it is accurate. He is someone who has simply never given this family a reason to remember him with anything other than fondness. But Harmon was careful to frame this as his own thinking rather than something the show had confirmed. The writer's room has never officially established Mr. Poopy Butthole's species, origin, home dimension, or the specific circumstances under which he first met the Smith family. The comic book series Lil Poopy Superstar, published by Oni Press, offers some additional context, describing him as a being from another dimension who is a planet-wide superstar in his home reality and who came to live with the Smiths in order to experience a more normal, quieter existence. But even that origin, which is not part of the television show's main canon in any formally confirmed way, does not answer the most basic question, which is how he got here, how he found them, and why them specifically. There is something worth sitting with in the structure of this mystery, because it is different from most of the other unanswered questions in Rick and Morty. The show's other great mysteries, the ones about Rick's past, or Beth's clone, or Evil Morty's future, all feel like mysteries the show is aware of and is choosing to withhold answers to for reasons of pacing, or thematic effect, or both. They feel like information that exists somewhere, in some writer's document or some producer's mind, even if it has not been shared with the audience yet. Mr. Poopy Butthole feels different. He feels like a mystery the show is not sure it has an answer to, like a character who arrived fully formed from some creative impulse that preceded explanation, who was too interesting and too strange and too genuinely warm to leave out, but whose origin was never pinned down because the pinning down would have required making a decision that nobody in the writer's room was certain was the right one. And there is an argument that leaving him unexplained is the correct choice, even now, even after 7 seasons, because the entire point of Total Recall is about the limits of memory as a foundation for trust. The episode asks a brutal question, which is whether the relationships people believe they have are really what they think they are, or whether the feelings of warmth and history and connection that make those relationships feel real could be manufactured and inserted without the host ever knowing the difference. Beth shoots Mr. Poopy Butthole because she cannot find evidence that her love for him is grounded in anything real, and the show plays that as a tragedy. She is wrong to shoot him. She causes genuine harm to a genuine person. But her logic, inside the rules of the episode, is not entirely flawed. What the show seems to be suggesting, through the fact that he bleeds and recovers and continues to be real in every verifiable sense, is that the feeling itself is the foundation. That warmth and affection and the specific quality of someone's presence in a life, even if the origins of that presence cannot be traced or verified, is not automatically false. The inability to explain how something began does not mean it is not real now. Mr. Poopy Butthole has been real to the Smith family for however long they have known him. He was real enough to be shot. He was real enough to recover slowly and painfully. He was real enough to go on living a full life after the episode that nearly killed him, accumulating the kind of ordinary, unglamorous continuity that fictional constructs never need to bother with. Marriage, children, physical therapy, a cane he eventually stopped needing. These are the details of a real life, not a performed one. And yet, the question of where he came from has no answer the show has been willing to give. He is perhaps the most honest mystery in Rick and Morty, in that the honesty lies not in withholding information, but in acknowledging that some presences in a life resist the kind of clean explanation that would make them easier to categorize. Some people are simply there, warmly and genuinely, and without satisfactory origin story, and the demand for an explanation before accepting them as real is the thing that causes harm, not the absence of the explanation itself. Beth learned that it cost Mr. Poopy Butthole a year of recovery and a permanent change in how he moves through the world. The show has not forgotten that cost. In every subsequent appearance, there is something between Beth and Mr. Poopy Butthole control that was not there before the shooting. A particular kind of careful tenderness on her side. The tenderness of someone who made a logical mistake that had an illogical and very human consequence. She hurt someone real by applying a test that should have been reliable and was not. That is not something that resolves cleanly. It is not something the show pretends to resolve. It simply continues, as he does, as the mystery of him does. Season after season, Mr. Poopy Butthole appears at the end of finales and in small moments between larger stories. Always warm, always present, always the same character who arrived without explanation and has declined every subsequent opportunity to provide one. The show has now run long enough that his unexplained existence has become a kind of constant. The way certain things in a long-running story eventually stop feeling like gaps and start feeling like atmosphere. He is simply there. He has always been there, or something close to always. The Smith family loves him, and he loves them, and the specific mechanism by which that came to be true is not something anyone has successfully mapped. Some threads in Rick and Morty are left open because the answers are being saved for later. Some are left open because the answers would diminish the mystery more than the mystery diminishes the story. And some, like Mr. Poopy Butthole, are left open because the people who created him looked at what he is and decided, perhaps correctly, that an origin story would make him smaller rather than larger. The warmth he brings is real. The family he belongs to is real, in the specific, complicated way that anything is real inside a show about a man who has personally watched reality collapse and reset more times than anyone could count. And the question of where he came from is still there, sitting quietly in the background of every scene he occupies, unanswered and, at this point, possibly unanswerable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mr. Poopy Butthole remains one of the show's most quietly stubborn mysteries, a character who simply exists without explanation and keeps existing without apology. The next mystery is larger and louder and has been building since season 1. A Morty who looked at his Rick, decided he had been used long enough, and then spent 4 full seasons becoming the most dangerous person in the entire multiverse. Section 4. Evil Morty and what the show still hasn't explained. He appears for the first time at the very end of an episode, and the reveal is so quick and so quietly confident that it takes a moment to understand what the show has just done. Season 1, Episode 10. Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. The episode spends most of its runtime building toward what appears to be a straightforward mystery. Someone is killing Ricks across the multiverse. The evidence points to Rick C-137, the Council of Ricks, that vast and self-satisfied institution of every Rick who ever decided that cooperation with himself was better than going it alone, arrests him and prepares to hold him accountable. Rick and Morty spend the episode on the run, trying to find the real killer, eventually uncovering what appears to be the culprit, a Rick who has been remote-controlled by some external force, his mind hollowed out and replaced with a signal. They stop him, they destroy the control device, they go home. And then, in the final seconds, the camera finds a Morty in the crowd of rescued Mortys. A Morty who looks like every other Morty, unremarkable and young and slightly overwhelmed. And he reaches up and removes a small device from behind his eye, the device that was controlling the Rick. He has been the one running everything. He has been the intelligence behind the entire operation, and nobody noticed because nobody thought to look at the Morty. The show cuts to black. It does not explain anything. It does not provide context or motive or backstory. It simply shows a Morty with a device and an expression that is completely unlike anything the regular Morty ever wears. An expression of cold, finished satisfaction. The look of someone who completed a task they have been planning for a long time and is now moving on to the next one. That image sat in the show's background for years. It appeared again in season 3, in the extraordinary episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up, where a Morty who had been living among the ordinary population of the rebuilt Citadel ran for president and won, and then, in the final moments, revealed himself to be the same Morty from season 1, Evil Morty, the fan name that the show eventually made semi-official through the way its own characters referred to him, was now the president of the most powerful institution in the multiverse. Every Rick everywhere was now answering, in some structural sense, to a Morty. It was one of the most genuinely shocking moments in the show's run, and it raised questions that the series spent the next several seasons very slowly and not always consistently working toward answering. The question that burned the longest was the simplest one. Why? What had been done to this particular Morty that turned him from whatever he started as into the person who could plan across years and dimensions and layers of institutional complexity with the patience and precision that Evil Morty demonstrated every time he appeared. What was the experience that broke him, or built him, or whatever the right word is for the process that produces someone like that? The Season 5 finale began the answer. Rick Mirai Jack revealed, through a scan of Rick C-137's memories, the full scope of what the Citadel had been doing to Mortys from the beginning. The relationship between Ricks and Mortys, which the show had always presented as complicated and occasionally toxic, but also genuine, was revealed to have a structural dimension that made it darker than it had appeared. Mortys were not simply companions. They were, in the language the show used, bred for forgiveness. Their presence dampened a Rick's genius signal, making it harder for enemies to track. They served a practical function, and the Citadel had been producing and distributing them with that function in mind, cultivating in each Morty the particular combination of loyalty and resilience and emotional availability that made them useful without making them dangerous. Evil Morty stood in front of Rick C-137 and said that being sick of his grandfather was what made him evil, and that any Morty who had ever been sick of his Rick had been evil too. Then he blew a hole in the central finite curve and left. It was a spectacular exit. It was also, in retrospect, the moment where the show answered one question clearly and left several others completely open. Season 7, Episode 5, Unmortrican, came back to him. The cold open showed a Rick and Morty arguing after a bad adventure, and then revealed that this was not the Rick and Morty the audience had been following. This was Evil Morty and his Rick, before any of it happened. The episode showed Evil Morty in the moments before his transformation from ordinary Morty to whatever he became, tired and pushed too far, and finally, quietly, deciding that he was done. He built the eye device. He took control of his Rick. He began executing a plan that he had apparently been designing in the background of his own servitude, waiting for the moment when the conditions were right to begin. The episode walked through the timeline of his plan, connecting the dots between his first appearance in Season 1 and his presidency in Season 3 and his escape in Season 5, showing how each step had been in service of a single goal. He wanted out. Not revenge, not power for its own sake, not some grand philosophical statement about the nature of Ricks and Mortys, just the simple, specific desire to be left alone in a part of the multiverse where the dynamic that had defined his entire existence no longer applied. And after all of that, after 7 seasons of build-up and 2 separate reveals and an origin episode that recontextualized everything that had come before, Evil Morty escaped into the wider multiverse, and the show essentially left him there. Which is where the open questions begin. The most immediate one is what Evil Morty is doing beyond the central finite curve. The show established that the yellow portal he used to escape accesses dimensions outside the curve, dimensions where Rick is not necessarily the smartest person in the universe, where the entire power structure that defined life inside the curve does not apply. Evil Morty wanted to reach those dimensions because they represented the only reality where he could exist without being defined by his relationship to a Rick. He succeeded. He got there, but the show has not followed him there. After Unmortican, Evil Morty has not appeared in any confirmed canonical context that explores what his life outside the curve looks like. Whether he found the peace he was looking for, whether the dimensions beyond the curve presented challenges he had not anticipated, whether the intelligence and the capability that made him so formidable inside the curve, a place specifically designed to contain and reward that kind of thinking, serves him in a genuinely different multiverse. Or whether it turns out that what made him extraordinary was partly a function of the environment he was fighting against. There is also the question of whether he is finished with Rick C-137 specifically. The show has been careful never to frame Evil Morty's conflict as personal in the way that Rick's conflict with Rick Prime was personal. Rick Prime killed Rick's family. That is a wound with a specific source and a specific target. Evil Morty's grievance is structural rather than personal. He does not hate Rick C-137 the way one person hates another person who has wronged them. He hates what Rick C-137 represents and what Rick C-137 helped build: the Citadel, the central finite curve, the entire system that turned every Morty in every dimension into a functional accessory to someone else's story. But Unmortrican complicates this slightly. Evil Morty chooses, at a key moment in that episode, to help Rick C-137 rather than leave him to die. He could have walked away. He had already extracted the information he needed from Rick Prime. His plan was complete. Helping Rick was not necessary for any goal Evil Morty had articulated. He did it anyway. The show does not explain why. It does not have Evil Morty explain why. He helps Rick, exchanges a look with him that contains more than either of them says out loud, and then leaves. That look is is one of the most genuinely interesting moments in the later seasons of the show, because it suggests that the relationship between Evil Morty and Rick C-137 is not simply adversarial, and never quite was. Rick C-137 is, after all, the Rick who eventually rejected the Citadel and the Council and the entire structure that Evil Morty spent years dismantling. He is the Rick who blew up the Citadel himself in the Season 3 premiere, for his own reasons, but the result was the same. He is the Rick who has, repeatedly and consistently, refused to be the kind of Rick that the system was trying to produce. In some structural sense, Evil Morty and Rick C-137 want versions of the same thing, which is for the machinery of Rickdom to stop running the way it has always run. Whether the show will ever return to this and develop it further is genuinely unknown. Evil Morty has been one of the most carefully constructed, long-term narrative threads the show has ever run, and the patience with which his story was told across 7 seasons suggests that the people writing him took him seriously as a character rather than simply as a plot device. But the show's relationship with serialized storytelling has always been uneasy. It resists the pull of ongoing arcs. It tends to resolve things and then move away from them before they can become weight the show has to carry. Evil Morty's escape was framed as a resolution, the end of his story inside the curve, but the wider multiverse he escaped into is so vast and so unexplored that it could easily become the beginning of something else. There is also a question about Evil Morty's intelligence that the show has never directly addressed, and it is one of the more interesting threads the whole character opens up. Inside the central finite curve, the entire multiverse was structured around the principle that Rick was the smartest person in any given universe. The curve existed to maintain that principle. Every dimension within it was, by definition, a dimension where Rick's intelligence was the ceiling. Evil Morty operated inside that structure and outsmarted every Rick he encountered. He was smarter than the smartest people in a multiverse built to keep the smartest people on top. What does that make him? And what does it mean that Rick C-137, who is himself operating at the outer edge of what the curve's internal logic can produce, looked at Evil Morty and seemed to recognize something? The show has not answered this. It has not even fully posed the question in explicit terms, but it is there, in the subtext of every scene they share, the sense that these two are measuring each other against a standard that neither of them entirely fits, and that the measurement is producing something neither of them quite knows what to do with. Beyond the questions about Evil Morty himself, his story leaves open a question about the Mortys he left behind. His stated motivation was to free Mortys from the system that had been exploiting them. He wanted out, and he framed his escape as something that other Mortys deserved too, the ability to exist outside the curve, outside the dynamic that had defined their entire lives. But his method of pursuing that freedom involved a tremendous amount of harm to the very Mortys he claimed to be fighting for. He tortured Mortys in Season 1 as part of his plan. He manipulated them in Season 3. The Season 5 finale showed the Citadel collapsing around Ricks and Mortys who had no part in the structures Evil Morty was tearing down, who were simply living their lives in the only world they had ever known. He got out. They did not necessarily get anything. Whether the show considers this a contradiction worth exploring, whether Evil Morty's freedom came at a cost that the narrative intends to reckon with, is something that remains open. The framing of his escape in the Season 5 finale was visually and musically triumphant. The yellow portal, the walking away, the sense of a door finally opening after years of trying. It invited the audience to feel something like hope for him, or at least relief. But the wreckage he left behind was real, and the Mortys who did not get a yellow portal are still somewhere in what remains of the curve, living in the aftermath of a revolution that served its architect more completely than it served anyone else. Evil Morty is, in the end, a character whose story the show has told with more care and more patience than almost anything else in its run, and whose final chapter has not yet been written. He is out there, somewhere beyond the edges of what the green portal gun can reach, in dimensions the show has not yet visited, doing things the audience has not yet been shown. Whether that absence is permanent, whether he has been given his ending and the show is done with him, or whether there is more story left in him that the writers are holding for the right moment, is one of the most genuinely open questions the series currently carries. He wanted to be left alone. Whether the show will honor that, or whether the pull of what he represents is too strong to leave dormant, is something only time and future seasons will answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Evil Morty got his yellow portal and his exit, but the questions he left behind are still sitting inside the show's logic, with nowhere comfortable to land. Next comes the oldest and heaviest mystery of all, the woman whose absence built everything, and what the show has never quite finished saying about her erasure from every dimension that exists. Section 5. The Diane Mystery and the Omega Device. There is a woman who appears in Rick Sanchez's life almost entirely through her absence. She is not in the show the way most important characters are in shows. She does not have episodes built around her perspective. She does not have scenes where the audience watches her make decisions and feel things and navigate the world in ways that reveal who she is. She exists, for most of the show's run, as a name and a shape and a voice that Rick programmed into his spaceship's computer because he could not stand the silence of driving without hearing something that sounded like her calling to him from the other room. She exists in blurred memory fragments and fabricated flashbacks and the particular quality of stillness that comes over Rick's face in unguarded moments when something in a scene touches the part of him he has spent decades trying to make unreachable. Her name is Diane. She was Rick's wife. She was Beth's mother. She died in a garage in Dimension C-137 on a day that started like any other day, and everything that Rick Sanchez has done from that moment forward, every dimension he has crossed, every enemy he has made, every bottle he has emptied, every relationship he has simultaneously needed and sabotaged, has been in some direct or indirect way a consequence of losing her. That is the foundation. But the mystery of Diane is not simply the mystery of what happened to her. It is the mystery of who she was, what she and Rick actually had together, what the show is saying about love and loss, and the specific kind of damage that comes from having something real taken away before you were finished with it. And underneath all of that is the question of what Rick is now that the reason he gave himself for everything he did has been resolved, and the person he was hunting is dead, and Diane is still gone and always will be. The show introduced the idea of Diane slowly and carefully, the way you introduce something that is going to matter. Early seasons referenced her only in passing, through Beth's occasional mentions of a mother she barely knew, and through the emotional texture of Rick's relationship with Beth, which had the specific, complicated quality of two people who love each other and cannot fully reach each other, and are not entirely sure whose fault that is. The show did not explain why Rick had been absent for most of Beth's life. It did not explain why, when he returned the way he did, arriving without announcement and installing himself in the garage, and behaving as though the decades of absence were simply a matter of scheduling, rather than a wound that Beth had been living inside for her entire adult life. Then Season 3 gave the audience a flashback. Rick, sitting in a memory, watching a younger version of himself with a woman and a small child, a garage in the background, an ordinary afternoon that looked like the kind of ordinary afternoon people do not appreciate until they no longer have access to it. Another Rick arrived. He made his offer. The Rick in the memory refused. The bomb fell. The woman and the child were gone. Except the show then revealed that the flashback was fabricated. Rick had constructed it himself, a fake origin story he had built and installed in his own memory, possibly because the real one was too painful to access directly, possibly because he wanted to control what could be extracted from him if someone ever got inside his mind. The show was careful to flag this as a decoy without immediately providing the real version, which meant the audience spent time between seasons sitting with the knowledge that even Rick's grief had been modified, that even the memory of the worst thing that ever happened to him had been edited and arranged and made into something he could manage. The real backstory arrived in the Season 5 finale and was confirmed and expanded in Season 7. The broad shape of it matched the fabricated version closely enough that the fabrication felt more like a protective filter than an outright lie. Another Rick came to the garage. Rick C-137 said no. The bomb fell. Diane died. Beth died. And Rick was left standing in the wreckage of everything he had chosen over the portal gun, with the knowledge that the choice had been punished in the most absolute way imaginable. What happened next is what the show revealed across multiple seasons in pieces, and it is the part of the Diane mystery that opens outward rather than closing. Rick Prime, the Rick who dropped the bomb, did not stop with Dimension C-137. The show revealed in Season 7 that after killing Diane in Rick's home dimension, Rick Prime had gone further. He had tracked down other versions of himself, other Ricks, who had also turned down his offer of portal technology, and he had killed their Dianes too. And then, at some point, he had built something called the Omega Device, a weapon capable of doing something that should not be possible, even by the standards of a show where impossible things happen every episode. The Omega Device did not just kill a person, it killed every version of that person across every dimension simultaneously. It reached into the infinite multiverse and removed Diane Sanchez from all of it, every variation, every alternate timeline, every universe where she had been born and grown up and made choices and become whoever she was in that particular reality. Gone. Not dead in the conventional sense, erased, as though the multiverse had been searched and cleaned and every instance of her had been quietly deleted. This is why, in a show that regularly visits alternate dimensions and parallel versions of the main characters, there has never been a living Diane. Not once, across 7 seasons, has the audience encountered a dimension where Diane Sanchez was alive and present and available to be met. The show used this absence as background texture for years before explaining it. Most viewers noticed it without being able to articulate what they were noticing. There were Beths everywhere. There were Ricks everywhere. There were Jerrys and Summers and Mortys in every configuration the multiverse could produce. But Diane was always gone, in every dimension, in every timeline, without exception. The Omega device explains the mechanism, but the explanation, rather than resolving the mystery, deepens it in a direction that the show has not fully followed. Because Rick Prime used the Omega device on Diane specifically. Not on Beth, not on Morty, not on any of the other people in Rick's life who could theoretically have been used against him or used to hurt him. He chose Diane. He erased Diane from every dimension that existed. An act so vast and so complete that it goes beyond anything that could be called personal violence and into something that does not have a clean name. It is a philosophical act as much as a murderous one. Rick Prime was not simply killing someone. He was making a statement, removing from the infinite multiverse the specific person whose existence represented the argument that choosing love over freedom was a valid choice. Rick C-137 turned down the portal gun because he had Diane. He said no to the version of Rick that gave everything up for pure intelligence and pure freedom because he had something that made the trade not worth it. Diane was the evidence that there was another way to be Rick Sanchez. Rick Prime, who had made the opposite choice and needed that choice to be correct in a way that bordered on compulsion, could not allow that evidence to exist anywhere. So he used the Omega device and made sure it did not. The show presents this and then moves forward without fully sitting in what it means. What it means is that Rick's grief is not ordinary grief. It is not the grief of losing someone to illness or accident or the ordinary violence of a world that does not care about individual lives. It is the grief of losing someone to a targeted erasure, a grief that contains within it the specific additional weight of knowing that the person was removed not by chance, but by intention, not by the indifference of the universe, but by the active will of someone who needed her not to exist. There is no other dimension where Diane lived a long life. There is no alternate timeline where she and Rick grew old together and Rick never became what he became. The Omega device closed all of those doors simultaneously. Rick killed Rick Prime in season 7. He found him and he beat him to death with his hands rather than with any of the extraordinary technology available to him, which the show framed as significant. This was not a clean or efficient act. It was the opposite of clean. It was the kind of violence that comes from the part of a person that precedes intelligence, the part that grief lives in when it has been living there long enough to become something structural rather than something felt. And then Rick Prime was dead, and Rick C-137 was standing in the aftermath, and Diane was still gone. This is where the mystery opens into something the show has not fully addressed. For decades, across all the time the show has covered, Rick had a purpose. The purpose was finding Rick Prime. It organized everything. It gave shape to the drinking and the running and the inability to stay still and the refusal to let anyone get close enough to be used against him. It gave the chaos a direction, even when the direction was not visible to anyone around him. Rick Prime was out there. Rick was going to find him. Everything else was marking time. Now, Rick Prime is dead, and the question of what Rick Sanchez is without the hunt is one the show has raised and not yet answered. The season 7 finale and subsequent episodes have shown Rick processing this in the specific way Rick processes things, which is to say, imperfectly and sideways, and with a tremendous amount of denial about how much processing is actually happening. He has tried to construct new purposes. He has thrown himself into other problems. He has been, if anything, more restless than before, because restlessness with a target is manageable, and restlessness without one is just restlessness. There is also the question of the Diane AI in Rick's ship. Her voice, Carrie Walgren, providing something that sounds like warmth filtered through the specific sadness of a recording that knows what it is, has been present throughout the show as a kind of haunting that Rick built for himself. He programmed her in. He made the choice to drive through the universe listening to something that sounded like her. That is not the behavior of someone who has made peace with a loss. That is the behavior of someone who has made the loss into an environment, who has arranged their daily life so that the grief is always present in a managed form, audible but not overwhelming, close but not crushing. What happens to that AI now that Rick Prime is dead dead is something the show has not fully explored. She was, in some sense, a motivational structure as much as a comfort. She kept him pointed toward the thing he had told himself he needed to do. Without that function, what is she? What is she to Rick? What does it mean that he built her and kept her and has been listening to her for years, and now the reason he built her has been resolved, and she is still there, still sounding like Diane calling from the other room, still present in the ship he drives through a multiverse that no longer contains a single living version of the woman she is meant to represent? The show has not answered this. It has let the questions sit, which is consistent with how the show has always handled Diane. She has never been fully explained. The glimpses have always been glimpses. The memories have always been partial or suspect. The AI has been present without being interrogated. And now, in the aftermath of everything that happened in season 7, she is still there, and Rick is still driving, and the grief is still the same grief it has always been, which is to say, enormous and mostly invisible and expressed almost entirely through the things Rick does rather than the things Rick says. One of the details from season 7 that deserves more attention than it received is the trap that Rick Prime left for the Ricks who came hunting him. He anticipated that other Ricks would eventually track him down, other versions of himself who had lost their own Dianes to the Omega device and wanted revenge the way Rick C-137 wanted revenge. So he built a killing ground. He built traps. And in the center of the killing ground, as the final obstacle, he put a robot wearing Diane's face. The choice to make the final trap a robot built to look like Diane is one of the most revealing things Rick Prime ever did. He could have built anything. He was, by every measure, at least Rick's equal in intelligence, and significantly his superior in pure ruthlessness. He had access to technology that could have produced any kind of weapon or obstacle. He chose Diane's face. He chose to make the final thing standing between the hunting Ricks and himself look like the person they had lost, which is either the cruelest possible tactical choice, knowing that grief would slow them down or break their concentration at the critical moment, or it is something more complicated. It is possible that Rick Prime could not stop himself from putting her face on things either. That the compulsion Rick C-137 has, the AI voice in the ship, the inability to fully move on, the way Diane organizes everything, even in her absence, is something Rick Prime shares in a different and darker form. He gave up everything to be free of attachment. He erased Diane from every dimension to eliminate the evidence that attachment was worth choosing. And then he built a robot with her face and put it at the center of his most personal and elaborate defense. That is not the behavior of someone who successfully freed himself from something. That is the behavior of someone who could not. The show has not said this explicitly. It has placed the evidence on screen and left the conclusion to the audience, which is consistent with how it has always handled the things that matter most. The Diane mystery is not going to be solved with an episode that explains everything cleanly. It is going to continue to unfold in the texture of Rick's behavior, in the small moments where something crosses his face that the scene around him does not account for, in the AI voice that keeps talking to him from the dashboard, in the space between who he was before the garage and who he became after it. A space the show has been carefully and honestly refusing to fully close for 7 seasons. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Diane's erasure from the multiverse was the wound the whole show was built around, and killing Rick Prime resolved the hunt without resolving the grief. Next, the story moves from the show's oldest mystery into its most structurally strange, the episode that froze time, fractured reality, and turned a sibling argument into one of the most unsettling paradoxes the series ever produced. Section 6, The Time Paradox of A Rickle in Time. It starts with a party. Not the kind of party that has consequences in the usual television sense, where someone says something they should not have said, or a relationship shifts in a direction it cannot come back from. This is a different kind of consequence. In the season 1 finale, Rick threw a party at the Smith family home while Beth and Jerry were away. A large and chaotic and thoroughly destructive party that left the house in a condition that Beth and Jerry could not be allowed to see. So Rick did what Rick does when a problem presents itself and a conventional solution would require either honesty or effort. He froze time. He stopped everything outside the house. Every person and animal and particle of the world beyond the Smith property, mid-motion, and gave himself and Morty and Summer the space they needed to clean up without the clock running. This worked. The house was cleaned. The damage was repaired. Beth and Jerry came home and found everything exactly as they had left it and suspected nothing. What Rick did not fully account for, or perhaps what he accounted for and considered an acceptable risk, was what it would do to the 3 people who had been living inside frozen time for the equivalent of 6 months. 6 months of existing outside the normal flow of reality. 6 months of moving and breathing and making decisions in a world world where nothing else was moving or breathing or making decisions. 6 months of being, in a technical sense, theoretical. Not quite real in the way that people are real when time is flowing normally around them, when the universe is ticking forward and their existence is embedded in that forward movement the way existence is supposed to be. When Rick unfroze time at the start of Season 2, he gave the three of them very specific instructions. Do not touch anything. Do not touch each other. Do not make any uncertain decisions. Do not allow any unresolved questions to hang in the air between them, because their timelines are not yet fully synchronized with the rest of reality, and any uncertainty, any moment of genuine not knowing, will cause the timeline to split. They are, in Rick's description, in a quantum uncertain state. They exist in a superposition, like a coin that has been flipped but not yet observed, and the act of observation, the act of any of them doing anything that introduces the possibility of two outcomes instead of one, will collapse that superposition in the wrong direction. Morty and Summer immediately start arguing about which of them is Rick's favorite. This is the kind of detail that the show does effortlessly, and that deserves more appreciation than it typically gets. The specific form of uncertainty that breaks time in this episode is not a scientific uncertainty or a philosophical one. It is the entirely ordinary, entirely human uncertainty of two young people who love someone complicated and cannot be sure how much they are loved back, and who express that uncertainty by competing with each other in a way that neither of them would admit is about love at all. The timeline does not fracture because of a malfunctioning device or a miscalculated formula. It fractures because of sibling rivalry, because of the specific emotional static that fills the space between people who are not sure where they stand with each other and with the person they are both trying to reach. The screen splits in two timelines, running parallel, each slightly different from the other in small but accumulating ways. In one, Morty steps left. In the other, he steps right. In one, Summer says one thing. In the other, she says something else. The differences are minor at first, almost imperceptible, but the show makes the visual language of this extraordinarily clear by presenting both timelines simultaneously, side by side, so that the audience is watching two versions of the same scene happening at once, and tracking the ways they diverge in real time. This is, technically, an insane thing to put on television. It is certainly an insane thing to put at the beginning of a season premiere, which is the episode that is supposed to welcome casual viewers back and establish the tone for everything that follows. A Rickle in Time is not welcoming, and it is not easy, and it makes demands of its audience that most animated shows would never consider making. The sound design alone is genuinely disorienting. Because both timelines are happening simultaneously on screen, both timelines are also happening simultaneously on the soundtrack, which means the dialogue overlaps with itself in a reverb that is not quite an echo because the two versions are not saying exactly the same things. The effect is deeply strange, in a way that takes a few minutes to adjust to, and the show does not wait for the audience to adjust before it keeps moving. The timeline splits again, then again. By the middle of the episode, the screen has divided into 4 versions of reality, all running simultaneously, all slightly different, all requiring Rick and his counterparts in the other timelines to work together across the dimensional divide in order to pull things back toward a single, coherent present. Rick, in each timeline, has to coordinate with the other Ricks, except the Ricks, being Ricks, immediately become suspicious of each other. Each Rick assumes the other Ricks are planning to solve the problem by eliminating the competing timelines, which would mean eliminating the Ricks in those timelines, which would mean killing themselves, which each Rick considers unacceptable when it is being done to him, and at least worth considering when it is being done to someone else. The paradox at the heart of the episode is elegant in a way that rewards attention. When Rick froze time, he created a bubble of arrested reality and then lived inside it for 6 months. That living, those 6 months of existing outside the normal flow, made Rick and Morty and Summer into people who are no longer fully embedded in the timeline they came from. They are between states. And the act of resolving that between state, the act of collapsing the uncertainty back into a single definite reality, requires a level of certainty from 3 people, one of whom is constitutionally incapable of certainty, and 2 of whom are teenagers, that turns out to be genuinely difficult to produce. Rick's solution, characteristically, makes things worse before it makes them better. He sits Morty and Summer down in front of a whiteboard in one of the split timelines and delivers what is ostensibly a speech designed to eliminate their uncertainty about where they stand with him, but which is actually one of the most deliberately cruel things Rick does in the early seasons. He tells them, flatly and without apparent emotion, that he does not prefer either of them, that they are equally unremarkable to him, that whatever competition they have been running in their own heads threads about who is closer to Rick, who means more, who would be chosen if only one of them could be. That competition has no winner because neither of them is winning anything. He is not choosing. He never was. The cruelty of this is that it is framed as the practical solution to a technical problem. Rick is not being mean. He is, from his own perspective, being efficient. The uncertainty that is fracturing time is rooted in Morty and Summer's emotional need. So he addresses that need by simply removing it. If they stop wanting to be his favorite because he has made it clear there is no favorite, the uncertainty resolves and the timelines can merge. It is a solution that works on the level of physics and fails completely on the level of being a decent human being to two young people who are in this situation because of a choice he made. The timelines do begin to merge, imperfectly and with complications, but the direction is right. And then Rick faces his own uncertainty, and the episode becomes something different. A fourth-dimensional being, a representative of whatever authority governs the laws of time in the show's universe, shows up to arrest Rick for abusing time. This being is officious and confident, and clearly expects Rick to be manageable. He is not prepared for Rick to be Rick. But during the confrontation, during the moment when things go badly, and Rick finds himself in genuine danger of being lost to the fractured timelines permanently, something happens that the episode treats with a seriousness that catches the audience off guard. It is brief, and it is immediately undercut. Rick, floating in the collapsing space between timelines, facing something that might be the end, says something that sounds like a prayer, and then immediately, upon surviving, denies that it happened and reasserts his position that there is nothing out there worth praying to. The show does not linger on this. It does not make a thesis statement out of it. But the Inverse essay from 2018 that analyzed this episode in depth made the argument that Rick's uncertainty in this moment, his genuine not knowing about whether there is something beyond the material universe that could hear him and respond, is the most honest expression of Rick's inner life that the early seasons produce. His atheism is not certainty in the other direction. It is a position he maintains because the alternative is too destabilizing to consider. The episode uses the structure of the time paradox to make this point in a way that a conventional dramatic scene could not. Rick's uncertainty about God, expressed in a moment of genuine crisis, fractures the timeline just as surely as Morty and Summer's uncertainty about his love for them did. The same mechanism, the same physics, Rick's emotional life operating according to the same rules as everyone else's, his not knowing causing the same kind of damage as their not knowing, even though he would never in a composed moment admit that his not knowing and their not knowing belong to the same category of human experience. The paradox resolves, the timelines merge. Rick punches Morty in one of the merged timelines, giving him the black eye that a future version of Rick had already given him in an earlier part of the episode, closing a loop that the show sets up without drawing attention to and pays off without fanfare. The black eye exists in the past because Rick gave it in the future, and Rick gave it in the future because it existed in the past. Neither moment is the origin, neither is the consequence. They are each other's cause, rotating in a circle that has no beginning point, a small and almost throwaway example of the kind of temporal logic that the show would later develop into much larger and more elaborate structures. What A Rickle in Time does with its paradox that separates it from most time-based storytelling is that it locates the source of the temporal problem, not in technology or accident or the kind of cosmic bad luck that time travel stories usually rely on, but in emotional uncertainty. Time breaks because people do not know how they feel about each other and cannot resolve that not knowing in the moment it needs to be resolved. The physics of the episode are real within the show's logic, but the engine driving the physics is entirely psychological, entirely about the specific difficulty of being sure of anything when the thing you most want to be sure of is whether you are loved by someone who is very bad at showing it. The episode aired in July 2015 and has been discussed primarily as a formally ambitious piece of television, which it is. But the formal ambition is in service of something that the show was doing more quietly in those early seasons, which was building the case that Rick's damage is not separate from the damage he causes. The frozen time that broke reality came from the same place as the deliberate cruelty on the whiteboard. The paradox that fractured the timeline was a consequence of the same refusal to be honest about need and connection that defines Rick's relationship with everyone around him. The time breaks and Rick fixes it and everything returns to normal, and none of the underlying causes have been addressed at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A Rickle in Time showed what happens when emotional uncertainty gets physics involved, and reality itself starts coming apart at the edges. The next paradox is louder and stranger. adventure, and begins with something as small and accidental as a dead snake floating in space, and ends with an infinite loop of snake terminators that the show used to say something surprisingly honest about cause and effect. Section 7. The Snake War That Should Have Never Happened. Rattlestar Ricklactica. There's a moment early in this episode where Rick tells Morty, with the specific exhausted certainty of someone who has seen this exact situation unfold before in various forms across various dimensions, to simply do nothing. The snake is dead. Morty killed it accidentally. It bit him during a spacewalk, a reflex action from a creature that was frightened and acting on instinct rather than malice. And Morty, also acting on instinct, grabbed it and threw it away from him, and the snake died in the vacuum of space. It was an accident in the purest sense of the word. No intention behind it, no calculation. Just two living things startling each other at the wrong moment in the wrong environment, with an outcome that neither of them would have chosen if they had been given time to think. Rick assessed the situation and told Morty to leave it alone. The snake was dead, the spacewalk was over. They had somewhere else to be. The appropriate response to an accidental death in space, according to Rick, is the same as the appropriate response to most things that cannot be changed, which is to acknowledge that it happened and then continue moving in the direction you were already moving. Morty could not do this. The guilt settled into him the way guilt settles into Morty, which is completely and immediately and without any of the psychological cushioning that most people develop over time to manage the weight of having done something they cannot undo. He could not stop thinking about the snake. He could not stop imagining that somewhere on the planet that snake had come from, there was a mission control full of snake scientists watching a telemetry feed go dark and understanding, in whatever way snake scientists understand things, that the astronaut they had sent up was not coming back. So Morty went and got a replacement snake. He found a snake on Earth, a regular terrestrial snake with no space training and no particular qualifications for representing an alien civilization, and he went back to the snake planet and released it into their space program. He thought he was correcting something. He thought he was replacing what had been lost with something close enough to what had been lost that the damage would be contained. This was, as Rick had predicted, and as the episode proceeds to demonstrate with increasing absurdity and increasing alarm, exactly the wrong thing to do. The snake planet, it turns out, was not a simple place. The snake astronaut that Morty killed had been on the verge of a historic mission, the first of its kind, a moment of profound cultural significance for a civilization that had worked toward it for generations. The snake Morty replaced him with was not a trained astronaut. It was a regular Earth snake with none of the preparation or the context that the original snake had. When this replacement snake arrived in the snake astronaut program, it disrupted something. And because the snake civilization was already in a state of internal tension, the appearance of a foreign and clearly different snake at this particular moment became the spark that ignited something that had been building for a long time. The snakes went to war with each other. And then the snakes, unified eventually by the common enemy that Morty's intervention had accidentally provided them, turned their attention outward and began developing the kind of technology that a civilization develops when it has a reason to reach beyond its own planet. They developed space travel. They developed weapons. They developed, with a speed that their trajectory would not have predicted without the disruption Morty introduced, time travel. This is where the paradox begins in earnest. And it is worth slowing down to trace the logic carefully because the show moves through it quickly, and the full shape of what it is doing is easy to miss at normal speed. The snake civilization developed time travel specifically because they wanted to go back and prevent the moment that started everything, which was Morty introducing the replacement snake. They wanted to undo the inciting incident, to reach back through their own history and remove the cause of the war that had defined their civilization's development. So they sent agents back through time, snake terminators in the show's language, heavily referencing the Terminator franchise in a way that is deliberate and funny and also structurally meaningful, because the Terminator franchise is itself built on a paradox of the same type. The machines send a Terminator back to prevent the Resistance. The Resistance sends a Protector back to counter the Terminator. Each action produces the conditions that make the other action necessary. The loop feeds itself. The snake version of this is, if anything, more complicated, because there are multiple factions involved, each with their own timeline agenda, each sending their own agents back and forward through snake history in ways that accumulate rather than resolve. Rick and Morty arrive in the middle of this and immediately make it worse, which is essentially the show's thesis on time travel stated in narrative terms. Every attempt to fix something introduces new variables. Every new variable creates new problems. Every new problem produces a new attempt to fix it, which introduces more variables, which creates more more problems, in a cascade that has no natural stopping point, because time travel, by its nature, gives everyone involved infinite opportunities to keep trying. The bootstrap paradox at the center of the episode is the Santa hat sequence, and it is worth examining because it is a perfect small example of a closed causal loop, the kind of paradox that does not require a villain or a mistake to sustain itself. It simply requires two events that are each other's cause. Rick and Morty arrive on the snake planet wearing Santa hats. They are wearing the hats because future versions of themselves appeared earlier in the episode and gave them the hats before disappearing back into the time stream. The hats are necessary for reasons the episode establishes within its own snake war logic. At the end of the episode, Rick and Morty travel back in time, find their past selves, give them the Santa hats, and then punch past Morty to give him the black eye that past Morty currently has, because past Morty has the black eye that future Rick is about to give him. Where did the Santa hats come from? They were given to past Rick and past Morty by future Rick and future Morty. Where did future Rick and future Morty get them? They got them from even more future versions of themselves, who got them from versions of themselves further along still, in a chain that has no origin point. The hats were never made. They were never purchased. They were never introduced into the timeline from outside. They simply exist in a loop, passing from one set of hands to the next set of hands forever. A physical object with no moment of creation, because every instance of their existence is downstream of a previous instance that is itself downstream of the one before it. This is called a bootstrap paradox, named for the impossibility of lifting yourself off the ground by pulling on your own bootstraps. The object, or the information, or the event exists without having ever been created. It pulls itself into existence by already existing. The logic is circular in a way that feels like it should collapse under its own weight, and yet, within the rules of the time travel framework the episode establishes, it holds together. The hats are real. Rick and Morty wear them. The loop is closed. Nothing about the situation requires an external origin, because the loop is self-sustaining. The show uses this to make a point about time travel that is both comedic and genuinely philosophically interesting, which is that causality inside a time travel story is not a chain with a beginning and an end, but a circle with no beginning and no end, and that the circle can be perfectly stable even though it contains no first cause. The hats do not need to have been made somewhere before they entered the loop. The loop itself is the making of them. They are their own origin. Dan Harmon had spoken about time travel at San Diego Comic-Con in 2015, describing it as a shark jumper, a dangerous toy that once introduced to a show's canon tends to swallow everything else because the implications are too large to contain. The box labeled time travel stuff sitting on a shelf in Rick's garage, visible in multiple episodes across the show's run, was a deliberate visual joke about the show's own reluctance to go there. It had shelved the idea. It had acknowledged the temptation and put it away. Rattlestar Ricklactica is the episode where the show finally opened the box, and the reason it works where it might have failed is that the show does not treat time travel as a solution. Every other time travel story, or nearly every other one, uses time travel as a tool that the characters employ to fix something. The journey through time is in service of a goal. The paradoxes that arise are obstacles to be overcome on the way to the goal. The story has a shape that points somewhere, and the time travel is the vehicle that gets the characters there. In Rattlestar Ricklactica, time travel is the problem. Every instance of time travel in the episode makes the situation worse. Rick and Morty's attempts to intervene in the Snake War, to go back and fix the thing that Morty started, each produce new complications that require more interventions that produce more complications, in a spiral that the show presents not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a demonstration of a principle. The principle is that interference compounds, that the desire to correct a mistake is itself a force that can generate more mistakes than the original one, and that the right response to some situations, the response that Rick tried to give Morty at the beginning of the episode, is to leave it alone and accept that it happened and move on. Morty could not do that. The guilt would not allow it. And because Morty's guilt drove him to interfere, a snake civilization that might have developed along entirely different lines was instead shaped by his intervention into something that built weapons and wars and eventually time machines, specifically to undo what he had done. The snake civilization's entire technological trajectory was determined by Morty's inability to sit with the discomfort of having accidentally done something irreversible. There is something in this that extends beyond the comedy and the snake Terminators and the elaborate Terminator references. The show is making an observation about the relationship between guilt and escalation that is more honest than it might first appear. Guilt, when it cannot be resolved through acceptance, tends to produce action, and action, when it is aimed at undoing something that cannot be undone, tends to produce more problems than the thing it was trying to fix. Morty did not set out to start a snake war. He set out to ease his conscience. The snake war was the consequence not of malice, but of the specific shape that Morty's particular kind of caring takes when it does not have a healthy outlet. Rick understood this before any of it happened. His instruction to do nothing was not callousness. It was the conclusion of someone who has watched enough attempts to fix unfixable things to know what those attempts tend to produce. Leave the dead snake where it fell. Feel bad about it for a while, move on. The feeling bad is not optional, but the interference is. Morty could have felt terrible about the snake without doing anything about it, and the universe would have been fine. He chose to do something about it. The universe produced snake terminators. The time police from season 2 return in this episode as well. The fourth-dimensional beings who showed up to arrest Rick in A Rickle in time, now showing up in the context of the snake war to observe and to not intervene, which is itself a commentary. The beings who exist specifically to enforce the rules of time are present in this episode and choose not to act, either because the snake situation is beneath their jurisdiction or because it has already become too tangled for intervention to improve it. The show does not explain which. It simply shows them watching, unhelpfully, while the paradoxes accumulate. The resolution, when it comes, is less a resolution than an acknowledgement that the situation has reached a state of sufficient absurdity that it can be walked away from. The snake war is not fixed. The timeline is not restored to anything that resembles what it would have been without Morty's interference. The various snake factions and their various time travel agendas are still out there somewhere in snake history, running their loops and sending their terminators and building their cases. Rick and Morty leave because staying would not make anything better, and because Rick has somewhere else to be. The dead snake is still dead. Morty's guilt about it has, if anything, more to feel guilty about now than it did at the beginning. The interference that was supposed to make things right made things considerably more complicated, in ways that will continue to reverberate through snake history long after Rick and Morty have moved on to the next thing, which is exactly what Rick said would happen. At the beginning, before any of it started, with the specific, weary accuracy of someone who has been right about this particular thing too many times to find being right about it satisfying anymore. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rattlestar Rick Lactica showed what happens when guilt drives interference, and interference drives paradox, a chain with no clean ending anywhere inside it. Next comes a quieter and more personal paradox, a pocket dimension where Morty's brief visits spanned thousands of years of alien civilization, and the beings inside built their entire world around something that barely knew they existed. Section 8. The alien civilization Morty accidentally created. Mort Dinner, Rick, Andre. There is a dimension that exists inside a cabinet in Rick's garage. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. There is a physical door in the garage that opens onto a pocket reality, a small, contained universe that operates according to its own rules, including, most importantly, its own relationship with time. Time inside this dimension moves faster than time outside it, significantly faster. The disproportion is large enough that a few minutes on the outside corresponds to a meaningful stretch of time on the inside, and Rick uses this property for a purpose that is practical and completely characteristic of him. He stores wine in there. Specifically, cheap wine that he wants to age rapidly so that it tastes like something worth serving to a guest he is trying to impress. He puts the bottles in, waits a few minutes in regular time, and retrieves wine that has been sitting in that accelerated environment long enough to develop complexity it would not otherwise have. This is the setup. What the setup produces is one of the most quietly devastating time paradoxes in the show's run, and it arrives wrapped in a storyline about a dinner party and an old enemy and a series of increasingly catastrophic choices made by a 14-year-old boy who was trying his best and kept making everything worse. The season 5 premiere, Mort Dinner Rick Andre, is structured around Rick's dinner with Mr. Mimbus, the self-described king of the ocean, a character introduced in this episode as one of Rick's oldest and most complicated adversaries, someone Rick clearly has history with that the show gestures toward without fully explaining. Rick wants the dinner to go well. He has prepared, he has cleaned, he has enlisted Morty and Summer to maintain the peace while he hosts, and he has, as mentioned, put wine in the pocket dimension to age it quickly before the meal. What Rick did not build into his planning, or what he built in and considered an acceptable externality, was Morty. Morty's role in the dinner was supposed to be simple. Rick gave him a task. The wine in the pocket dimension needed to be retrieved at a specific moment. Morty was supposed to go in, get the wine, come back. Straightforward, bounded. The kind of errand that should not generate consequences. But before Morty went in to retrieve the wine, he had been talking to a girl named Jessica. This is important context because Morty's interactions with Jessica, whom he had been interested in for the entire run of the show up to this point, had a specific effect on his decision-making that tended toward the catastrophic. He was invited to a party at her house. The party was happening in regular time, outside the pocket dimension, and it was the kind of social opportunity that Morty's 14-year-old brain could not process rationally alongside the task Rick had given him. He went into the pocket dimension to get the wine. He also, at some point during the retrieval, ended up staying longer than he was supposed to. The exact sequence of how this happened is less important than the consequence, which is that Morty's presence in the pocket dimension, a presence that was supposed to be brief and functional, stretched out into something that, from the perspective of the beings living inside that dimension, was an event of monumental and repeated significance. Because here is what the beings inside the pocket dimension experienced. A figure arrived, a young humanoid creature, appearing suddenly and without warning in their world, doing things they could not fully comprehend, and then disappearing again, and then reappearing later, and then disappearing again. From Morty's perspective, each visit was short, a few minutes of regular time. From the perspective of the beings inside the dimension, each interval between his visits was not minutes. It was generations, decades, centuries. The civilization that developed inside the pocket dimension had enough time between each of Morty's appearances to be born, to grow, to build, to develop culture and religion and agriculture and architecture and war and peace and all the accumulated complexity of a society moving through time, and then to age and decline and restructure itself around the anticipation of the next visit. Morty became, for this civilization, something between a god and a recurring natural disaster. The show presents this through a series of vignettes, each one a different era of the pocket civilization's history, each one defined by how that era processed and contextualized and responded to the existence of Morty. In the early eras, when the civilization was young and the memory of Morty's first appearance was still fresh enough to be transmitted through direct oral tradition, he was worshipped. He was the originating figure around whom an entire religious framework had been built, a being of incomprehensible power who arrived from beyond the known world, did things that could not be explained by any natural law, and then left, promising by his very nature of return to return again. The religion built around him was not a simple one. It had the internal complexity of a belief system that has been tested by time and by the experience of waiting, and by the specific theological crisis that arises when a god does not behave the way a god is expected to behave. Morty did not arrive on schedule. He did not respond to prayers. He did not seem aware that he was being prayed to. He showed up when he showed up, stayed for what felt from his side like a few minutes, interacted with the civilization in ways that were shaped entirely by his own situation and his own panic and his own ongoing attempt to manage whatever crisis he was currently in, and then left again. And the civilization, across its generations, had to keep revising its understanding of what he was and what his presence meant and what was being asked of them in the face of his indifference. This is where the episode becomes genuinely strange in a way that rewards attention. Because the pocket civilization's relationship with Morty passes through several distinct phases across the episode's vignettes, and each phase reflects a different way that people have historically processed the experience of devotion to something that does not respond to them in the way devotion expects. There is the early phase of pure worship, sincere and uncomplicated, a civilization that has not yet been disappointed enough to develop theology. There is a middle phase where doubt enters, where factions emerge, where some members of the civilization insist that Morty's apparent indifference is a test, and others begin to suggest that the original interpretation of his nature was wrong, and that a more accurate understanding might require abandoning some of the founding assumptions. There is a later phase that is considerably darker, where a leader who has decided that Morty is not benevolent, but predatory, not a god to be worshipped, but a force to be resisted, manages to redirect the civilization's energy toward arming itself against the next visit. And then Morty shows up again, and the civilization, having spent generations preparing to resist him, encounters the reality that he is a confused teenager who is trying to get wine and also maybe make it to a party. And the gap between what they prepared for and what they got is so vast that the episode plays it simultaneously as comedy and as something quietly devastating. The Inverse essay from 2024 that analyzed this episode described the Pocket Civilization storyline as one of the show's most sophisticated explorations of the the relationship between scale and meaning. From Morty's perspective, the pocket dimension is a storage unit with a time quirk. From the civilization's perspective, Morty is the central fact of their entire history. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither of them cancels the other out. The civilization's devotion is real, even though its object is unaware of it. The generations of waiting and building and revising and suffering and hoping are real, even though the being they were directed at was only in the room for a few minutes of his own subjective experience. This is the paradox the episode is actually interested in, and it is a more human paradox than the mechanical time loop paradoxes that other episodes build around. It is not a question of causality or bootstrap loops or the impossibility of changing the past. It is a question of what happens when two beings exist in such radically different relationships with time that genuine understanding between them becomes structurally impossible. Morty cannot experience the pocket civilization's history because he is not present for it. He can be told about it, and he is, as the episode shows him what his brief visits looked like from the inside, but being told is not the same as having lived through it, and the gap between those two things is not one that empathy alone can fully close. And yet, Morty is not indifferent to what he learns. This is one of the things the show does in this episode that elevates it beyond a straightforward comedy of errors about unintended consequences. When Morty understands what his presence has meant to the beings inside the pocket dimension, when he grasps the scale of what has been built and lost and rebuilt around the fact of him, he is genuinely distressed by it. Not in a way that he can translate into effective action, because the situation by that point is well beyond anything a 14-year-old can manage, but in the specific way that Morty absorbs terrible things, which is fully and personally and without any of the distance that would make it easier to carry. He did not mean to create a civilization. He did not mean to become a recurring theological event. He was trying to get wine and also make it to a party. The consequences of his presence in that dimension are entirely disproportionate to anything he intended or could have anticipated, which is true of a lot of things Morty does, but is true in this episode at a scale that is almost impossible to fully absorb. There is also the question of what the episode is saying about Rick's culpability in all of this, which the show raises briefly and then does not fully develop. Rick built the pocket dimension. Rick established the time disparity as a feature rather than a bug, specifically because the rapid aging of the wine was the point. Rick knew, because Rick knows essentially everything relevant to any situation he has created, that a significant time differential existed between the pocket dimension and regular space. Rick sent Morty in there with wine retrieval as the stated task, while simultaneously giving Morty several other things to manage, including the ongoing chaos of the dinner party, and the ongoing crisis of his social life, and the general weight of being Morty at 14 in Rick's orbit. Whether Rick anticipated what would happen in the pocket dimension, whether he considered the possibility that Morty's extended presence might produce exactly the kind of civilizational consequence the episode shows, is something the show does not directly address. Rick's awareness is always difficult to calibrate, because he is simultaneously the most prepared person in any room, and someone who genuinely does not always account for the human variables that other people would consider the most important ones. He may not have thought about what Morty's presence would mean to beings whose timescale is so different from Morty's that a single visit is an epoch. He may have thought about it and considered it irrelevant to his wine storage needs. The episode does not say. It moves forward, as the show tends to move forward, with the consequence established and the cause left partially open, and the characters doing the best they can with the situation they are in, rather than the situation they would have chosen. What the pocket civilization storyline leaves behind is an image that the episode earns and that stays. A group of beings who spent their entire collective history, generation after generation, organized around something that was barely aware of them, who built their world around a presence that was never present in the way they needed it to be, who waited across centuries for visits that lasted minutes, and found ways to make meaning out of the waiting, because the alternative was to look at the waiting and find nothing there. There is a version of this that is purely comedic, and the show finds that version and uses it. But there is also a version of this that is genuinely sad, and the show finds that version too, and holds both of them at the same time without resolving the tension between them into something simpler than what it actually is. Morty made it to the party eventually. Jessica was there. The pocket civilization had, by that point, been through several complete cycles of rise and collapse and reconstruction, all of it downstream of his decision to stay a little longer than Rick told him to. The wine was good, apparently. Rick seemed pleased with it. The beings who aged it across their entire civilization's history were not consulted about whether they found the arrangement satisfying. They were not present at the dinner table. They were back inside the cabinet in the garage, in a dimension that runs on a different clock, preparing everything in whatever way civilizations prepare for the next time the sky opens and something arrives that does not know their names, but has, nonetheless, shaped everything they have ever been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Pocket Civilization built its entire history around something that barely knew it existed, a paradox of scale and meaning hiding inside a wine storage joke. Next, the paradox goes even deeper, reaching back before the show began entirely, into the question of whether Morty's own existence is a closed loop with no first cause and no clean origin anywhere inside it. Section 9. The time loop that built itself, the flesh curtains, and Morty's paradox existence. Most origin stories have a beginning. There is a moment, somewhere back in the chain of events, where something started that had not existed before. A decision was made, a meeting happened, a particular set of circumstances aligned in a way that produced a consequence, and that consequence produced another consequence, and eventually the chain of causes and effects arrived at the thing whose origin the story is trying to explain. The chain might be long, it might be complicated, but somewhere at the back of it there is a first cause, something that began without being caused by anything downstream of itself. Morty Smith does not have one of those. This is not a metaphor about the mystery of his character or the ambiguity of his relationship with Rick or any of the other genuinely interesting thematic questions the show raises about who Morty is and what he is becoming across its run. It is a structural claim about the logic of his existence inside the show's own established rules. Morty Smith exists because he saved Rick's life at a specific moment in Rick's past, and Rick's life, having been saved, eventually produced the circumstances that led to Morty being born, which means Morty was born because he saved Rick, and he saved Rick because he was born, and neither of those events can be identified as the first one because each one requires the other to have already happened. This is the closed loop at the center of Morty's existence, and it is one of the most genuinely vertiginous things the show has ever introduced, partly because it was introduced not in the television series itself, but in a comic book, Rick and Morty Presents The Flesh Curtains, published in 2019, and partly because the show has never fully reckoned with what it implies about everything else. The Flesh Curtains was a band. This detail matters because the band is where the loop begins, or where it ends, depending on which direction you are moving through the causality. Rick, in his younger years, before the garage and the Smith family and the decades of running and fighting, was in a band called the Flesh Curtains. He played with a version of Bird Person, his oldest and most complicated friend, and the band existed in that specific register of young people doing something creative together that is partly about the music and mostly about the feeling of being young and connected and part of something that seems like it might matter. The comic establishes that during the Flesh Curtains period, Rick experienced a moment of genuine crisis. The details of the crisis are less important than the consequence, which is that Rick's life was in danger, and someone intervened to save it. That someone was Morty. A version of Morty who traveled back through time specifically to prevent Rick from dying at that moment, because Rick's death at that point in his life would have produced a cascade of consequences that would have prevented Morty from ever being born, which creates the loop. Morty traveled back to save Rick because he needed Rick to survive in order for his own existence to be possible. Rick survived, and the chain of events that followed eventually included Rick finding his way to the Smith family, becoming part of their lives, becoming Morty's grandfather, being present in the circumstances that produced Morty. Morty was born, and the loop closed. The Morty who traveled back in time to save young Rick is the same Morty who exists because young Rick was saved, and there is no version of the timeline where you can identify which of these events came first, because neither of them came first. They are each other's origin. They circle each other in a closed causal structure that has no external anchor point, no moment where something happened that was not itself downstream of something else in the same loop. This is a more destabilizing idea than it might initially appear, because it raises a question about Morty that the show has never directly posed, but that the loop's existence quietly introduces into every scene he occupies. If Morty's existence is a bootstrap paradox, if he exists not because of a straightforward chain of causes with a genuine beginning, but because of a loop that sustains itself by already existing, then in what sense does Morty have an origin at all? He was not born, the way people are usually said to be born, as the downstream consequence of events that preceded him and would have continued whether or not he existed. He is, in a specific and literal sense, the cause of his own existence. The loop required him to go back and save Rick, and the loop required Rick to survive and eventually contribute to Morty's birth, and the loop required Morty to exist so that he could go back and save Rick. And there is nowhere in this structure where you can point and say, this is where it started. Rick and Morty has always been comfortable with the idea that its characters exist in a multiverse, where identity and continuity are more complicated than they appear on the surface. The Cronenberg episode established early that Rick is capable of simply moving to a new dimension when the old one becomes uninhabitable, replacing a dead version of himself and settling into a life that was not originally his. The clone storyline established that two versions of the same person can exist simultaneously, without either of them being definitively more real than the other. The show has spent 7 seasons poking at the question of what it means to be a continuous self in a reality where the self can be duplicated, replaced, time-traveled, and dimension-shifted in ways that make the ordinary assumptions about personal identity feel unstable. The Flesh Curtains loop takes this further than any of those storylines, because those storylines were about what happens to a person when the conditions of their existence become complicated. The loop is about something more fundamental. It is about whether the conditions of Morty's existence were ever straightforward to begin with, whether there was ever a version of Morty's origin that did not involve a paradox at its core. There are fan theories, some of them quite well developed, that suggest the entire Rick and Morty multiverse is structured around closed loops of this kind, that the show's refusal to identify a clean origin point for the C-137 Rick and Morty story is not simply a narrative choice about keeping things mysterious, but a reflection of the actual logic of the universe the show has built. A universe where cause and effect are not a straight line, but a vast and complicated web of circles, each one feeding into the next, none of them having a beginning that exists outside the web itself. The show has never confirmed this reading. It has also never denied it, which is consistent with how it handles most of its deepest structural questions. It sets up the conditions for a particular interpretation, builds the evidence for it across multiple episodes and supplementary materials, and then declines to make the interpretation official, leaving it in the space between confirmed and speculative, where the most interesting ideas tend to live. What the loop does to the character of Morty, thematically rather than logically, is significant. One of the things that the show has been doing with Morty across its run, sometimes explicitly and sometimes in the background of larger storylines, is building the case that Morty is not simply Rick's accessory. He is not just the emotional ballast that keeps Rick tethered to something human, while Rick's genius pulls him toward pure abstraction and pure self-sufficiency. He is someone with his own trajectory, his own development, his own capacity for the kind of moral reasoning that the show consistently positions as the corrective to Rick's tendency to treat ethics as an obstacle rather than a framework. The loop suggests that this trajectory, this development, this capacity, all of it was present from before the show began, in a form that the show has never fully shown. A version of Morty confident and capable enough to navigate time travel for the specific purpose of preserving his own existence is not the Morty of Season 1, the anxious and easily overwhelmed teenager who stumbled through his first adventures with Rick in a state of more or less continuous distress. The Morty who went back to save Rick had already become something, had already developed whatever it is that made him capable of that kind of action, that kind of self-possession, that kind of clear-eyed understanding of what needed to happen and willingness to make it happen. The show has been tracking Morty's development across its run, showing him becoming gradually more capable and more confident and more willing to push back against Rick in ways that early season Morty could not have managed. The loop implies that this development was always going somewhere specific, that the trajectory the show has been building toward in the television series was already known and completed by a version of Morty who traveled back and closed the circle before the audience ever met him. There is something quietly extraordinary about this if you sit with it long enough. It means that the Morty the audience met in the pilot, the nervous and self-doubting teenager who seemed like the least likely person in any room to do anything historically significant, was already, at that moment, someone whose future self had already acted decisively enough to preserve the entire chain of events that would eventually produce him. He was always going to become whatever he needed to be to go back and do what needed doing. The development the audience watches across 7 seasons is not the story of someone becoming something they were not. It is the story of someone becoming something they already were, in a future the show has shown only in glimpses. The Flesh Curtains comic also raises, without fully pursuing, a question about Rick's awareness of the loop. Rick knows things. This is one of the show's most consistent and most deliberately handled character traits. He knows more than he says. He understands hides more than he reveals. He has information about situations, about people, about the past and the future and the structure of the reality around him that he distributes selectively, giving out only as much as serves his immediate purposes and keeping the rest behind the particular wall he has built around everything he would rather not be asked about directly. Whether Rick knows that Morty's existence is a bootstrap paradox, whether he has worked out the loop and understands that the Morty sitting next to him in the ship is a person whose origin is a closed circle that includes a future version of himself saving a younger version of Rick, is something the show has not answered. The comic establishes the loop without establishing Rick's knowledge of it. The television series has not addressed it at all in explicit terms, but the question of what Rick would do with that knowledge, if he has it, is genuinely interesting. Because Rick's relationship with Morty has always been complicated by the asymmetry of what each of them knows about the other and about the situation they are in. Rick knows things about Morty that Morty does not know about himself. He has said things over the course of the show that suggest a level of understanding of Morty's nature and Morty's potential that goes beyond what a grandfather would naturally develop through ordinary observation. He has, at key moments, treated Morty as someone whose development matters in a way that exceeds the practical, as though the outcome of Morty becoming whoever he is going to become is something Rick has a stake in that is not simply about having a useful companion on adventures. If Rick knows about the loop, then some portion of his investment in Morty's development is an investment in the conditions of his own survival. He would be, in a specific and strange sense, cultivating the person who already saved him. Watching Morty become the Morty who will go back and make sure Rick lived long enough to meet Morty. The recursion of this is almost too tight to hold in mind all at once. A man helping a boy become the person who already saved the man's life before the boy was born. All of it contained within a relationship that is presented on the surface as chaotic and often dysfunctional, and occasionally genuinely loving in the specific way that Rick loves things, which is intensely and indirectly and almost always in ways that could be mistaken for something else. The show has not confirmed any of this. It has placed the loop in a comic book and left it there, adjacent to the television canon, without being fully incorporated into it, available for those who seek it out and invisible to those who do not. Whether the loop will ever become part of the television show's explicit storyline, whether a future season will return to it and develop its implications in the same way that Evil Morty's story was developed across years of careful setup and eventual payoff, is genuinely unknown. What is known is that the loop exists, that Morty's existence, traced back far enough, arrives not at a beginning but at a circle, that somewhere in the logic of the show's universe, a version of Morty who had already become whatever he needed to become, traveled back through time and saved a younger Rick and closed the circle that produced him, and the show has been living inside that circle ever since, without ever fully turning to look at it directly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Morty's existence traces back not to a beginning, but to a circle, a loop that holds itself together by already existing with no first cause anywhere inside it. The final section pulls back from individual mysteries to look at the whole shape of the show at once, asking whether the multiverse, the resets, the clones, and the fractured timelines are all part of one enormous structure the show built without ever fully naming. Section 10. The show that refuses to end. Rick and Morty's relationship with its own timeline. There is a version of Rick and Morty that ended in Season 1. Not because the show was canceled, not because the story ran out of places to go, but because the logic of what happened in that season should have made continuation impossible. Rick and Morty turned everyone on Earth into Cronenbergs, grotesque biological mutations that bore only the faintest resemblance to the people they had been before the experiment went wrong. The planet was destroyed in the specific sense that the civilization on it was gone, replaced by something that could not be reasoned with or reversed. Rick's solution was not to fix it. His solution was to find a dimension where the problem had already been solved by other versions of themselves who had died in the process of solving it. Move into that dimension, bury the bodies of their alternate selves in the backyard, and continue as though nothing had happened. This moment, early in Season 1, established something about the show that most television does not attempt and that almost no television sustains across multiple seasons. It established that continuity in Rick and Morty is not guaranteed by the laws of narrative. Characters do not persist because stories require them to persist. They persist because Rick finds a way to keep them persisting. And Rick's methods for doing this are not clean and not honest and leave residue that the show accumulates rather than resolves. The bodies in the backyard are still there. The original Earth is still Cronenberged. The Rick and Morty who walk through the rest of the series are, in a precise and literal sense, not the same Rick and Morty who started it. They are replacements who took up residence in a life that was not not originally theirs, and they have never told anyone, and the show has never pretended this is not the case. Everything that comes after that moment is, in some structural sense, happening inside a paradox that the show established and then kept building on top of without resolving. The multiverse framework that allows Rick and Morty to dimension hop freely is not just a plot device. It is the condition that makes the show's particular relationship with consequence possible. In a universe where there is always another dimension, there is always another version of the problem that has already been solved, another version of the person who has already died so that this version does not have to, another reality that can be moved into when the current one becomes too damaged to continue inhabiting. Death is not permanent. Mistakes are not permanent. Nothing is permanent except the accumulation of all the things that have been done and cannot be undone and have been left behind in dimensions that the portal gun can still technically reach, but that nobody is going back to. This is the deepest paradox the show has constructed, and it is the one that contains all the others. Rick has died multiple times. The show established early, through the Edge of Tomorty episode, and through multiple other instances across its run, that Rick's death, even his death in the dimension that the current story is taking place in, does not end his story. There are backups, there are clones, there are other Ricks who can step into the narrative when the current one is gone. The show has made this explicit enough that Rick's mortality, which should be the ultimate constraint on any story about a character, functions instead as a revolving door. He goes through it and comes back from the other side wearing a slightly different face. Or not even that, wearing the exact same face because the backup was thorough and the clone is indistinguishable. What this does to the show's relationship with stakes is something the writing has had to work against continuously. If nothing can permanently end, if every death is potentially reversible and every mistake is potentially escapable by dimension hopping to a reality where the mistake did not occur, then the emotional weight of any given moment depends entirely on the audience's willingness to believe that this particular instance matters, even though the system as a whole has shown repeatedly that instances do not have to matter. The show earns this belief when it earns it, not through the mechanics of the story, but through the characters' emotional responses to what happens to them. Rick's grief over Diane is real and permanent, not because the multiverse could not theoretically contain a living Diane somewhere beyond the Omega device's reach, but because Rick's experience of the loss is real and permanent and is carried in his body and his behavior in ways that no dimension hop has been able to reset. The show's timeline is not a line. It has never been a line. It is something more like a coral reef, built up from layer after layer of accumulated choices and consequences and resets and replacements, each new layer growing on top of the previous ones without dissolving them. The whole structure becoming more complex and more dense with each season, while the surface continues to look, from a distance, like the same show about a grandfather and a grandson going on adventures. Under that surface, the accumulated paradoxes and unresolved mysteries and structural impossibilities have been building into something that the show has not yet fully named. Consider what the show actually contains at this point in its run. There is a Rick whose original wife and daughter were murdered before the series began, who moved into a dimension where alternate versions of his family were already living, and has been functioning as their Rick ever since without telling them he is not their original. There are two Beths, neither of whom knows which is the original, both of whom have accepted that the question may never be answered and have chosen to continue living their respective lives in full knowledge of that unresolvable ambiguity. There is a Morty whose existence is, in the comic canon, a closed causal loop with no external origin point, who has been becoming, across 7 seasons, whatever he needs to become to close a circle that was already closed before the show began. There is an Evil Morty somewhere beyond the central finite curve in a part of the multiverse that the show's portal technology cannot currently reach, carrying information about the Omega device and the structure of the curve that no other character possesses. There is a Mr. Poopy Butthole with no confirmed origin who has been part of the Smith family for an unspecified length of time and who continues to appear at the edges of the story without explanation. Each of these threads is unresolved. Each of them represents a question the show has raised and not answered, a narrative commitment that has been made and not yet paid off, a structural element that is load-bearing in ways that the surface of the show does not always make visible. The show has been running for over a decade and has accumulated the kind of complex, layered, unfinished business that most long-running television tries to avoid, because unfinished business tends to become weight, and weight tends to slow things down, and slowing down tends to lose audiences who came for the momentum. Rick and Morty has a different relationship with its unfinished business than most shows do. It treats the accumulation situation not as a problem to be managed, but as a feature of what the show is. The multiverse structure means that no thread ever has to be definitively abandoned, because any abandoned thread could theoretically be picked up in a different dimension where the events played out differently. The reset button logic means that no situation ever has to be resolved in a way that forecloses future stories, because a dimension hop or a clone or a backed up consciousness can always reintroduce what appeared to have been concluded. The show has built for itself a structure that is essentially paradox-proof, in the sense that any apparent contradiction can be resolved by invoking the multiverse, and any apparent ending can be undone by invoking the same. But this structural flexibility comes with a philosophical cost that the show has been circling for several seasons without fully landing on. If nothing has to end, what does it mean for anything to matter? If every death can be reversed, and every mistake can be escaped, and every timeline can be abandoned for a better one, then the show's emotional investments, its grief over Diane, its investment in Morty's development, its long, slow building of Evil Morty's arc toward a conclusion, all of it rests on the audience's willingness to believe that these particular instances are different, that the grief is real even though Rick could theoretically dimension hop to a universe where Diane was not erased by the Omega device, that Morty's development matters even though there are infinite dimensions containing infinite Mortys at infinite stages of development, that Evil Morty's escape was significant even though the curve has already been partially restored and the multiverse continues more or less as it was. The show knows this. Dan Harmon has spoken in multiple contexts about the tension between the freedom the multiverse structure provides and the narrative cost of that freedom, the way infinite possibilities can paradoxically make individual stories feel less significant rather than more. The central finite curve itself, as a concept, can be read as the show's response to this tension. By establishing a bounded subset of the multiverse, a wall around infinity that limits the dimensions the story takes place in to those where Rick is the smartest person, the show was imposing a constraint on its own infinite freedom. It was saying that not all of infinity is equally relevant, that the story takes place inside a specific subset with specific rules, and that subset matters in a way that the broader infinite multiverse does not. Evil Morty tearing down the curve at the end of Season 5 was, among other things, the show dismantling its own constraint, opening the narrative out into a genuinely infinite multiverse where Rick is not necessarily the smartest person, where the rules of the curve do not apply, where the logic that has governed the show's universe from the beginning is no longer the only logic in play. Season 6 partially restored the curve, which suggests the show was not entirely ready to follow the implications of having torn it down, which is itself a kind of paradox. The show opened a door, looked through it, and partly closed it again without fully committing to either the opening or the closing. What exists now, after 7 seasons, is a show whose relationship with its own timeline is as paradoxical as anything that happens within any individual episode. It is a show that has died and replaced itself, that has moved dimensions when the current one became too damaged, that has cloned its own characters and left some of the clones running in parallel with the originals, that has introduced closed causal loops at the level of its own character's existence, that has built and destroyed and partially rebuilt the institutional structure that organized its multiverse, and that continues to move forward through all of this accumulated complexity with the specific, breezy confidence of a man who has seen reality collapse enough times to have stopped being surprised by it. The mysteries and paradoxes that have been sitting throughout this video are not separate problems waiting for separate solutions. They are expressions of the same underlying structure, a show that was built around the idea that the questions are more generative than the answers, that the accumulated weight of unresolved things is more honest than the false tidiness of a story that knows where it is going and arrives there cleanly. Rick Sanchez has never known where he is going in any clean sense. He has a direction, sometimes, and a purpose, sometimes, and something that functions like a plan when circumstances require it. But underneath all of that is a man navigating a reality that he understands better than anyone else alive, and that continues, nonetheless, to surprise him. The show that contains him has the same quality. It understands its own structure better than almost any other animated series on television, and it continues, nonetheless, to produce episodes and seasons and story developments that feel genuinely unexpected, that could not have been straightforwardly predicted from what came before, that arrive with the specific quality of things that were always possible but were not inevitable. That quality is what the unresolved mysteries preserve. As long as Rick's past is not fully finally mapped, the character retains the capacity to surprise. As long as the Beth clone question has no official answer, both Beths remain fully realized people rather than one real person and one narrative convenience. As long as Evil Morty is out there beyond the curve doing things the audience has not seen, the multiverse retains its sense of genuine scale. As long as Mr. Poopy Butthole has no confirmed origin, his presence in the Smith family carries the specific weight of something real that cannot be fully accounted for, which is how most real things feel when you examine them closely enough. The paradoxes are not flaws. They are not things the show has failed to resolve because resolution proved too difficult or too time-consuming or too likely to disappoint. They are the architecture. They are the structure that holds the show's particular kind of meaning in place, a meaning that depends on the world being larger than any explanation of it, on the characters being more than any account of them can fully capture, on the questions outlasting the episodes and the seasons and the years in a way that keeps the whole thing alive. Rick and Morty is a show about a genius who cannot stop moving, because stopping means sitting with everything he has lost and everything he has done and everything he has failed to be. The show itself has the same energy. It cannot stop moving. It cannot settle into a final accounting of what it is and what it means and where all its threads lead. It keeps going, dimension after dimension, paradox after paradox, mystery after mystery, building something whose full shape can only be seen from a distance that the show has not yet reached. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.